Okay, Gregg Lagerquist, anchor and political reporter at CBS 13 WGME in Portland, Maine, joining Ballot Battleground, Nevada. Greg, thank you so much for doing this and for making me think about lager.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ben, for having me. You're right. I always tell people Lagerquist is Swedish for the quest for beer, which of course is not true, but who cares? It makes for a good story. But it
I
helps
love
people
that.
pronounce it correctly. So Lagerquist.
There we go. Lagerquist. Okay, I have to ask you before we dive into
Yeah,
the main topic today, ranked choice voting. You got one of the first ever Walter Cronkite Awards for Excellence in Political Coverage. I just
I
read
did.
this on your bio. I went to the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. So, how cool is that? Especially you got to
Outstanding.
meet Mr. Cronkite when he was alive, right?
I did. Yeah, I was going to say I got that award in and it was for covering ballot initiatives, of which one of we're going to about to talk about here on your
Wow.
podcast. But yeah, I won that I think like 25 years ago now. It's been a long time. But yeah, that was one of the professional honors of my life, was to meet Walter Cronkite in person. It was at a ceremony down in Washington D.C. and I met Tim Russert there. There was a lot of folks there, and I had great support from Sinclair, our parent company, as well that day. It was a fantastic opportunity for sure.
That's really cool. We could chat for half an hour about meeting Walter Cronkite, the legend. But first, let's kind of talk about who you are for our
Mhm.
audience is new to you and kind of your experience covering Maine politics for some time now.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ben. Yeah, I've been covering Maine politics for almost 30 years now. I try not to admit my age, but I guess I just revealed it. I've covered every New Hampshire primary, for example, which is right across the border from us here in Maine, it's going back to 1996. And again, I've covered Maine politics since the mid 90s. So it's been a long time. And Maine has a very robust referendum system. We have a lot of issues that come up, and ranked choice voting was one of them a number of years ago. So, yeah, I'm into politics. I know a lot of people probably either. I feel like two types of people. There are people who run to cameras and run away from cameras when it comes to people we're trying to interview, and there are people who love politics and those who want to have nothing to do with it. Hopefully, we'll find some middle ground for our podcast here. But yeah, I love politics, always have. So I'm thrilled to be here today.
Awesome. Well, yeah, you're a perfect guest for this show. So let's start from when the ranked choice voting effort or push really began in earnest in Maine. When did it start? When did it start to gain steam?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. It actually started around the time I won that Walter Cronkite Award. It was the first actual legislative bill that was put in before the Maine legislature to introduce ranked choice voting in Maine was way back in 2001.
Wow.
So it was a long time ago, and literally there were some representatives who put it in every single session for more than a decade,
Hmm.
trying to get this passed, and it failed. It failed every time throughout the early 2000s. And it finally passed under a ballot initiative, a statewide referendum in 2016. And it went into effect. The first time it really was going into effect would have then been 2018, our first round of elections that it had a direct impact. So it was a long fight in Maine. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it didn't pass by a vast majority. It was fairly close. But voters said, yeah, let's give this a try. And helping that in Maine was the fact that there was already some local municipalities, for example, Portland, the largest city in Maine, Portland, Maine, by the way, the first Portland, not the one out in Oregon. Um, Portland, Maine had ranked choice voting for local municipal elections for city council seats, for example, before there was the statewide vote. So there had been some experience with it in that regard. But yeah, passed became a statewide law in 2016, and we've been having it ever since.
Interesting. Yeah, you guys kind of seem like the incubator, if you will, having
Yeah,
used
one
it
of the first.
at the city level, and I believe the first to implement it statewide in 2016.
Mhm.
It's a little bit different than the law that is proposed here in Nevada. So just walk me through the nuts and bolts of, it's is it open primaries, and then is it final five, final four? How exactly does it work?
Yeah, no, it's open. It's everybody who makes the ballot is in ranked choice. So, for example, we've had some municipal elections in Portland where there have been like 5 or 6 or 8 candidates for mayor, for example.
Hmm.
And ranked choice will go through, the way it's designed, the way it was sort of sold to voters. And I think it's similar sort of selling points from supporters in Nevada is it's sort of an instant runoff, right? That's the view. Like, hey, if you're going to try to get to a majority, not just a plurality. So you got to get to 50% of the vote plus one vote in order
Hmm.
to win. And everybody who's in sort of, if it's a open election, every single person who qualifies for a ballot, whether at the statewide level or frankly, federal races, the ranked choice voting in Maine applies to federal candidates as well. So everybody who makes the ballot is subject to ranked choice voting, and they'll just obviously eliminate from the bottom one person at a time. Then sending their votes of that last place person to the ones above them. And if no one's gotten to a majority after that happens,
Yeah.
you go one by one until most of the times you end up with two people standing. And one of those people will be above 50%. So that's been our experience here in Maine. One quirk to Maine, and I think this is not really relevant to Nevada, but the only race and seat that it doesn't apply to in Maine is governor. And that's because there's a specific line in the Maine state constitution that refers to electing a governor of Maine by plurality. And it was adjudicated, it was looked at, and they said, you know what? We don't think ranked choice applies to the governor's race only because the Constitution speaks to voting, allowing somebody to be elected by a plurality, meaning less than 50% of the vote. As long as you are the one with the most votes, you don't have to get to 50% to win. So that's only the governor's race in Maine. So kind of a quirk to
Yeah.
our system, but so far voters seem fairly comfortable with it. So it's been,
Yeah.
like we said, it's been 6, 8 years now.
Just to clarify, so there is no primary that narrows down the long list of candidates to a shorter list.
No, it depends on the race.
Yeah.
Mayoral races do not have a primary in Maine, for example. Legislative races can, but in many cases, so if you have even a congressional race, it does apply to primaries in Maine as well. And then the winners of that will win the state primary, and they move on to our Maine has its primaries the presidential primary is in March usually here in Maine. And the statewide primary, which applies to statewide races and legislative races and often local races as well, happens the second Tuesday of June. So then we would narrow it down. And the ones who tend to be the other candidates on the ballot by the time we get to the general election in the fall are those independents. Maine has a lot of independents. For example, right now, Maine is the only state that has an independent, Angus King, who, by the way, is up for re-election and will be subject to ranked choice voting. He's the only independent currently in the United States Senate, is my understanding, because Bernie Sanders, I think, didn't he officially I got to think about that for a second. Anyway,
Yeah.
one of the very few independent, there's a robust
Sure.
history of independence in the state of Maine. So that's when we get to the general election. Those are the folks who are, for example, I just mentioned the U.S. Senate race in Maine. There are two independents who've made the ballot, and there's a Republican and the Democratic nominees. So all four of those candidates will be on the ballot in Maine here in less than 5 weeks now. And it will be subject to ranked choice voting. So we'll see. Angus King is the presumptive leader, according to the early polls,
Yeah.
an popular incumbent. So he might already be above 50% by the time the votes are tallied, or he might be below. And if that's the case, we'll start to do ranked choice voting.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So our listeners here in Nevada hopefully are familiar with Nevada's initiative, which
Mhm.
is different because we're narrowing it down to the final five. So that is a
Yes.
caveat. It differs significantly from Maine's, but in the end, ultimately, it is that instant runoff, the ranked choice voting in the general election. Has it worked as intended?
It depends
And
on who
have
you
there been
ask.
hiccups? Okay.
I wouldn't say there've been any hiccups. It's worked smoothly. There's two caveats to this that people should expect when it comes to ranked choice voting. One is that it tends to take time. Sometimes if it's a close race, you will not know the outcome of the election for potentially days after the polls close, after election
Mhm.
day,
Yeah.
because it takes some time to go through the ranked choice process. So we've had examples where it's been a close race, where it's been 4, 5, 6 days before a winner's been declared after the ranked choice process plays out. So that's one thing that voters, I think, do need to get used to. And I think that that's one place where some folks have said, hey, this is, maybe not working the way we intended. Although important to note, structurally, legally, there have been no hiccups. It's worked fine. It's worked the way it was promised and intended. But that's one thing. Two, we have already had one case and it was in a congressional race in Maine's
Mm.
second district. Maine has two congressional seats. And Maine's second district is a very purple district and actually leaning slightly red. Currently, it has a Democratic congressman representing it, but he upset the incumbent in 2018 under ranked choice voting. So,
Mm.
follow along here, folks. After the first round, the incumbent Republican, Bruce Poliquin, won the race after the first round of voting, but he only had about 47% of the vote in 2018.
Wow.
So there was an independent, there were three candidates on the ballot, an independent, the Democratic nominee, and the Republican nominee. The first round, the Democrat was in second, the Republican was in first, the independent a distant third. They went to ranked choice runoff. About 80%, as I recall it, of the votes for that independent then broke
Mm.
for the Democrat. And that
Mm.
Democrat, actually, I have the numbers right here. It was, as the Mainers would say, wicked close. Um, the final was, yeah, 50.6% for the Democrat, now incumbent Jared
Wow.
Golden, to 49.4% for the Republican who at that point had been the incumbent. So
Mm.
right out of the bat, literally 2018 was the first year that Maine started applying ranked choice voting to congressional races. And right away we had a flip. If there had not been ranked choice voting, Bruce Poliquin would have won that race. The Republicans would have retained control of the seat. Because there was ranked choice voting, it flipped. The Democrat then, after the apportion of the third candidate's votes, got to above 50% and was declared the winner. So two ways to look at that. One, did it work the way it was said it would and the way it was promised? Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
If you're a Republican, or especially if you're Bruce Poliquin, are you very angry at that outcome? Yes, you are. And
Yeah.
we should make it clear too, Ben. It's not, I know that I think that Democrats tend to be more in favor of ranked choice voting than Republicans do, but in theory, ranked choice shouldn't benefit one party or the other, depending on the political dynamics of the particular race at stake.
Right.
So there could be, for example, uh, a Republican district where there's a Republican right-leaning independent stealing votes, quote unquote, stealing votes away from the Republican, and the Democrat might be ahead after the first round. And after you apportion those third or even fourth, or in Nevada's case, up to 5 candidates, you might then see the Republican win. So it's in theory non-partisan.
Right.
Um, but so far, the only big example we've had in Maine was it flipped a Republican seat to a Democratic seat after they used it. So that
Interesting.
that ruffled some feathers, to be sure.
I'm sure. Yeah. It seems like the research I've done, roughly 90% or maybe more of the elections that are run, it's the person that gets the most votes in the first round goes on
Yes.
to win, but you still have every once in a while kind of that upset, if you will. Have voters been confused by this, or have they come to understand it and appreciate it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ben. I think for the most part, voters do understand it, and again, appreciate might be a weighted word because, like I said, I think there are still some who feel like it benefits one party over the other, although it should be apolitical.
Yeah.
But I do think that no, I think that Maine voters are comfortable with it. There still are clearly some voters who may not like it, but I think that the vast majority of voters understand it and are comfortable with it as a concept and a process. They're not like confused by it still. But there was a lot of splaining that we had to do early on,
Yeah.
especially during we covered it extensively in 2016 because it was a statewide ballot question. So we did a
Yeah.
lot of reporting in 2016 as voters were going to have to make up their minds on this, just as they are in Nevada in 2024.
Absolutely. We are explaining left and right here on our end as well. One last question before we go.
Sure.
Later on in this episode, we're hearing from an Alaska reporter who's telling us about the effort to potentially repeal ranked choice voting in
Yeah.
Alaska. Has there been any sort of movement along that front in Maine, or do you feel like it's pretty much cemented?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. There were efforts in the legislature to repeal the law because ultimately it is, it's a state statute that created this in 2016 in Maine. So there have been efforts to repeal it. So far, those efforts have failed, and so I would say it's on very firm footing. I would not say it's cemented that it would never be repealed,
Sure. Yeah.
but there's definitely, I think, a comfort, and I think that calls to repeal it have been muted over the
Mm.
last few years. There were, as you might imagine, as we were saying a moment ago, after 2018, after the outcome of that congressional race, there were some loud cries to repeal it. And by the way, it was challenged in court. Bruce Poliquin
Mm.
challenged ranked choice voting in court
Really?
after the outcome he lost. And they upheld the law and they upheld the ruling. So in essence, that experience with that close of a race and with the outcome changing actually led to a court case that essentially helped to further codify it, that there's precedent in Maine law that
Right.
affirms ranked choice voting. So yeah, it's a long way of saying that I think it's pretty firmly established in Maine right now, but never say never.
Of course. Yeah. And I lied. One last question, which is,
Sure.
any words of caution or advice, or maybe things that Nevadans voters here should be thinking about as they're kind of weighing this reform that to us here in the Silver State is new, and we haven't had it for many years like you guys.
Yeah, I would say that again, you think about what you're comfortable with. The voters I've heard who really like it, and I've heard this frankly from people across the political spectrum who like the idea. We've heard that about wasting your vote, for example. For example, I know I've talked to folks here in Maine who are in favor of RFK Jr. And by the way, he's still on the ballot in Maine and will stay on the ballot. And the old saw is, do I really want to quote waste a vote on
Sure.
a third party or fringe or distant third candidate? Well, when there's ranked choice voting, there's no such thing as a wasted vote. You vote for who you want, and you have the choice, by the way. That's something we should also mention, Ben. You have the choice. You don't have to list your second, third, fourth, or fifth choice on the ballot. You can do that in Nevada too. You can just
Right.
list
Yeah.
one. And if your person loses, then there's no ranked choice vote that's coming from you. But if you do want to rank them, then you can do that. And then, hey, I'm going to vote for, in my example, RFK Jr., but then I'm going to put second Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. And then my second choice I know is most likely to actually get my vote. And I haven't, quote, wasted a vote. That's been one of the biggest arguments in favor of it. But that's something voters should really kind of absorb. And again, the other thing that it could take, like I mentioned earlier, there can be time, there can be a delay. I wouldn't call it complicated, or I wouldn't call it confusing, but it is somewhat complicated in
Sure.
terms of the process of counting the votes. So there's that factor too. And three, you got to be comfortable with the idea that you may have an outcome where somebody could win under a plurality and that can flip. So I
Yeah.
guess those would be the words of quote unquote caution. But as long as voters understand what they're voting for, that's the case in any election. Understand what you're voting
Yep.
for and go ahead and pull the trigger.
Absolutely. And that's what we're trying to do with this podcast and with our question 3 debate and with the help of you. So thank you so much, Greg, for joining us. I think that was a really succinct, simple way to understand how this has played out in your state. Appreciate getting some of your time, Greg. We'll let you get back to reporting on Maine politics.
Thanks very much, Ben. I appreciate your time. I appreciate being here.